our next speaker is Teresa. Are you ready? Wonderful. I will pass it over to you.
So I would sort of pick up where Paula just left off. I've spent the majority of my career working a good deal in pharmaceuticals, consumer products, and medical devices. Interestingly enough, I had the opportunity to host an inspection many, many years ago in which we were the contract manufacturer for another major corporation. And it was indeed that corporation that received 483 and the subsequent warning letter and not our manufacturing site. That was long before the requirements for quality agreements ever existed. And I was in the position, Paula would be interested to know probably, that we had to expurgate parts of a business contract in what was called at that time Exhibit E, that really contained what much later would have been contained in a quality agreement. Next slide. And click again, and again, and again. All right. So I had a boss many, many years ago within Johnson & Johnson who said, you can delegate or outsource your responsibilities, but you can never delegate your accountabilities. And that was at a time when the organization was doing quite a bit of outsourcing to either rationalize, right-size the supply chain, move to a more regionalized supply chain strategy. And there was an undertone, certainly, of cost savings that was part of the agenda. And one of the things that was constantly asked of him was, so how many resources will you be saving in quality when we do all of this outsourcing? And this was his response in quotes. I've taken that to heart and lived with that the majority of my career, and I've requoted him many, many times. FDA and other global regulatory authorities, as Paula has well summarized, expect the sponsor of the NDA or the BLA to maintain accountability for the products from early stage clinical development all the way through commercialization. FDA has a GMP guideline for phase 1 clinical trial material that allows certainly flexibility with respect to GMPs, but as you look at ICH E6 revision 2, it makes it pretty clear that GMP applies to clinical development and that there must be adequate oversight of all third-party contract manufacturers, packagers, and distributors in that stage of development. The requirements certainly are defined in GMPs, but I think there's a lot more clarity in the ICH standards and in the recent FDA guideline that talk about the need for a quality system at the sponsor and the CMO, CDMO, and puts the sponsor dead in the center of having to have oversight over all activities that are outsourced. And as Paula summarized, the regulations and requirements have evolved significantly over the past 25 to 30 years. And what I've seen happen in industry as a participant in industry for the majority of my career is that there's been a good deal of outsourcing to expand capacity, reduce cost, or perhaps build capability or expertise. There are a huge number of virtual companies leveraging outsourcing as a key strategic advantage. We see many of those in biotech, cell therapy, gene therapy, and we see some of those emerging even in some of the novel small molecules. There are a lot of lessons that have been learned through inspection and enforcement activities, and I think FDA brought a lot of those lessons learned into what they prepared in the final guidance document. And there has definitely been a harmonization of requirements across global health authorities, including FDA, particularly when we look at some of the ICH requirements that lay out the responsibilities for third-party manufacturing. Next slide. And keep clicking. And one more time. There you go. So this is sort of a summary. You know, I think from an industry perspective, I always, as I grew up in GMP early on in my career, the word supplier was used only once, referencing component and raw material suppliers. Certainly, as Paula summarized, there were some indirect references, but no specific requirement for a quality agreement, and certainly not a lot of direction about what should be in one. And there was not a lot of specificity that talked about how to oversee outsourced operations. What we saw from 1990 into 2015 was a lot of regulations and ICH standards evolved. And I think, you know, as we moved into latter years, what we saw in the FDA guidance document was a framework for the contents of a quality agreement between the IND, NDA, BLA holder and the CDMO or CMO. Next slide. And I think that in that FDA guidance, it became very clear that the need for someone thinking of virtually manufacturing, they needed to have some form of a quality system. The quality system needed to include any and all outsourcing, and the manufacturer is required to ensure that a third party is qualified before signing a contract with that firm. Now, this is interesting because I can tell you from an industry perspective, there are a number of times that I've seen quality agreements and or supplier qualification audits conducted after an MSA was already signed and approved in an organization. And I think this is a place where, as legal counsel, you have the opportunity to sort of reinforce this third bullet point that the manufacturer is required to make sure that that third party is qualified before that contract is finalized. Next slide. So in ICH Q10, it talks a lot about pharmaceutical quality system and wants to make sure that processes are in place to assure the control of outsourced activities and quality of purchased materials. And it indicates that those should incorporate quality risk management and include at minimum the following: establishing and assessing the suitability and competence of potential contractors before outsourcing or selecting material suppliers. That can be done through audits, material evaluations, or certainly other evaluation qualification criteria, defining the manufacturing responsibilities that are needed in a written agreement known as the quality agreement, and then monitoring and reviewing the performance of the contract facility and identifying and implementing any needed improvements. This, for me, is what I think of as living into the quality agreement. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Next slide. The FDA guidance talks a lot about sponsors, NDA, BLA owners, that they commonly use contract facilities to perform some drug manufacturing or distribution activities. I think certainly as we moved from 2000 to 2005 to 10 to 15, FDA absolutely realized there was a significant amount of growth in the contract manufacturing industry, so to speak. It requires sponsors and NDA, BLA owners to maintain oversight and a quality agreement. And I love that word oversight because I think often there are many organizations that put a quality agreement in place and don't think through what a properly risk-based oversight program looks like. And it requires a quality system to be established at both the sponsor and the CDMO, CMO. I cannot tell you how many times I'm asked by the gene cell therapy, sometimes the bio companies, the small novel pharma companies that are virtual, how many times they ask me, well, can't I just use the SOPs of my CRO, my CDMO, my CMO? And my answer is always no. You need to have your own quality system that defines how you interact with and what things you do to maintain oversight, qualify and select, et cetera, your third parties. Next slide. So further on in that guidance, it talks about each party engaged in the manufacture of a drug is responsible for ensuring compliance with CGMP for the manufacturing activities it performs. I certainly learned that firsthand as I introduced myself. We had a challenging inspection at a site that I was the senior director of quality for. And honestly, we manufactured for a third party outside of our corporation. And that third party was really brought to bear and was deemed responsible in the 483, but as I said, also in the subsequent warning letter. So long before this requirement or this guidance on quality agreements was written in 2016, FDA was already able to take action against firms that were outsourcing manufacturing. For both owners and contract facilities, it's important that oversight and controls over the manufacture of drugs include the management of the risk, making sure you establish safety, and you must make sure that everything associated with the manufacturing of the drug and the finished product, that you have control as the sponsor of the NDA or the BLA. And the drugs not manufactured in compliance with CGMP are adulterated. Next slide. So, I've watched over my 30 some years in industry, how industry has adapted to the changes in standards and guidelines and paid attention to the precedents and the feedback from FDA and the experiences that various firms have had over these last years. I think what I saw originally in the 80s and the 90s was I saw a qualification audit. And I would see a business contract that would often say, and products should be manufactured in accordance with GMP or current GMP. And that was as far as it extended during the 80s into the early 1990s. I think I then saw that by the 1990s into 2010, I saw not only qualification audits, but I also started to see the emergence of quality agreements. And while during that time, FDA never said a quality agreement was an absolute requirement, as Paula well outlined, there was a lot of inference to that fact. And in fact, during that time frame, I was frequently asked, can I see your quality agreement and see how roles and responsibilities are divided up between both parties? What I've seen since 2010, I think, and these are approximate timeframes, is I've seen much more focus on not only the content of the quality agreement, but this oversight of outsourced production and folks in industry trying to think through how to take a risk-based approach to oversight of production. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. Next slide. And you can unfold that slide. And once more, there we go. There. So, when I think of living the equality agreement, I will say this. Getting the quality agreement signed can be a challenge. Sometimes it's death by revision. And to be honest, sometimes when the attorneys get involved, it can be complicated. On the other hand, when quality agreements are written by quality professionals alone, sometimes the legal GMP interests of both companies are not totally well described in that quality agreement. I will say that the complexity of managing a quality agreement is actually a much larger challenge. And I think that the key question appears on the right side of this slide. Which of the quality systems at the sponsor need to be linked to the third-party quality management system? So if you think about what typically happens in a third-party arrangement, you produce documents that are linked to what was in your NDA or your BLA. You have non-conformances at the third-party site that directly impact the product that need to be contemplated and hopefully reviewed and approved by the sponsor. You have CAPAs that can be requested by the sponsor that the third party execute to improve issues in the manufacturing process. On the other hand, third parties can assign CAPAs or request CAPAs of the sponsor to address the design of a test method, the design of a production process, the specifications involved for a raw material, an API, an in-process control, etc. Then there is the major topic of change control. How does change control happen in the facilities? And how do you define in the quality agreement and how specific do you get when contemplating, okay, the third party is going to make a major modification to their water for injection system. Is that something that the sponsor needs to have purview to? Well, I would argue or submit that if the product is a parenteral and it's a 95% USP water for injection, I would think that whatever the third party is doing with their water for injection system would be a critical raw material and a critical change that the sponsor would need to be quite aware of and understand the impact of. Then, of course, there is third-party selection, qualification, and oversight, product quality complaint management, and how those interactions occur. Those are some of the major quality systems that need linkage between the third party and the sponsor. But in fact, even when it comes time for annual product review, the sponsor is responsible for conducting an annual product review. They will need a significant amount of data and information from the third party. If the quality agreement doesn't say, you need to provide me that information in a 30-day window or 60-day window from when my annual product review needs to be completed, the third party can delay the completion of the annual product review by a significant time frame, and the sponsor will be accountable for having a delayed and an overdue annual product review, which per GMPs happens annually. The sponsor and the third party will need to figure out how to engage collectively in the process of quality management review and how to look at things like trends and nonconformances. Are there CAPAs that are needed? who owns the CAPA, the sponsor or the third party. If it's a combination product and there's a heavy load of complaints for device malfunctions, is that part of the third party because there are issues in execution of production? Or is that an issue with the sponsor in the design of the device or the specifications for some of the componentry of the device that are causing device malfunctions? Certainly risk management comes into play here, and both parties. I think philosophically, as the quality agreement is being generated, I think you're developing a relationship here, which is a marriage. And yeah, there's an opportunity for divorce, but in that marriage, it's good to understand the philosophy about risk management and the philosophy about data integrity so that as a supplier is selected and the third party is confirmed, that the companies understand alignment, or if not, how information will be incorporated into the quality agreement that will enable the sponsor to have a successful relationship with the third party. And of course, in field alert reporting, recall, market withdrawal, AE reporting, there is a need often for investigations to support complaints and AEs, and that will require a lot of interaction with the third party. Next slide. So at its worst, what have I seen in my practice? Well, at its worst, the quality agreement is approved. It's filed. It's never looked at again until someone requests it in an audit, or there's a significant quality issue impacting product supply that the companies then have to work together to resolve. And what I see in those cases often is literally the quality agreement is approved. It goes into an electronic or a hard metal filing cabinet, fireproof, of course. And then it's implemented through a combination of what I call humanware. So there's either very low-tech software or a lot of email. There's often weekly conference calls between that company and amongst mid-level dedicated quality staff, and they can exchange over the course of a year tens to hundreds of emails weekly between third-party manufacturing companies. Any one of those emails could contain important or critical information in one or two sentences. Example, we're changing the specification for glycerin. A one-sentence email. The third party receives it. They get hundreds and hundreds of emails every day from all the people that they manufacture for, and they miss it. And they continue to receive glycerin against the old specification. There's not a good closed loop system for providing that updated spec to the third party with written confirmation they've received it and an implementation date because the change control systems aren't linked and it's all done by email. The opportunity for miscommunication in these cases causes costly errors. Often they impact product supply. They often impact availability of products, sometimes at the store shelf, sometimes to the patient themselves, and the financial goal impact or the financial impact is often very high. And it's at that moment when it's at its worst that someone in procurement or the business will say, what kind of agreements do we have with this third party that's making this mess for us in the boardroom at a board meeting? And someone will say, well, we have an MSA, and someone in quality will say, well, we have a quality agreement. Yet those documents haven't been looked at and there's no real process or systems that allow the commitments made in those agreements to actually be honored on a day-to-day living basis. And then, of course, beyond the product and the patient impact and the financial impact, what happens in these circumstances at its worst is that there's a lack of trust that builds up between the third-party manufacturer and the owner of the BLA NDA. And it makes it very difficult for collaboration. And in those circumstances, those are the situations where I usually see the most FDA activity. I see the highest levels of complaints, the highest level of deviation, nonconformance, overdue CAPAs, and I really see a lot of indicators coming out of the quality system where there's a third-party manufacturing that indicate that that relationship and that process is broken. Next slide. So what do I see at its best? Well, what I see at its best are lean portal-based technical solutions between both parties that enable exchange of information. workflow that allows document types and information. There are shared metrics between the highly capable quality staff in each company. And I see the business relationship between the company and the third-party manufacturer strengthen over time. And it is at that point that you can actually say that there's really a true strategic partnership. They're living into their commitments, and their commitments to each other are always front and center in front of them. They have metrics that say, you will finish a complaint investigation for me in 15 days, and I will measure that 15 days. The third party will measure that 15 days themselves. We'll come together in a joint meeting on a monthly or quarterly basis and say, we're doing a good job at this. And if we're not, we need to investigate why. And we need to understand on both sides, is it I'm getting complaints to you late? Or is it that you're taking too long? Or is there something in between that's making it difficult? I see at its best tremendous financial and supply chain benefits of a supply chain being able to fully leverage internal and external capabilities. And certainly we have products approved today that are breakthrough therapy products, orphan drug products, rare disease products that would not be available on the market if third-party manufacturing wasn't available to enable them. The relationships between the individuals across companies is one based of trust. And I see that the patient and the consumer's needs sit front and center and are fully met each and every time they experience the product. And that product quality is an outcome and compliance is achieved through the creation of a robust living quality agreement that's implemented through the use of lean portal-based solutions. Now, I will say that this is not easy. You know, today we have IT tools that have portals, but we also have a lot of IT security overlay because of things we've seen in our industry from an IT security perspective. And there are certainly data integrity concerns, but there has to be a way and decisions have to be made early on in the relationship and before the quality agreement is signed on, okay, when a deviation or nonconformance happens in the plant, am I going to get a fax of that? Am I going to get an email attachment of that? Am I going to have access to your nonconformance tool so I can go in and review it and prove it? How am I going to access that information? And how are you going to make sure that you don't release a batch and ship it to my warehouse before I've approved deviations impacting the product? Next slide. So key takeaways, and you can click through all of these. I think a key takeaway for me from a compliance perspective is you can delegate and outsource your responsibilities, but you never delegate your accountabilities. I think the second thing is that oversight of outsourced work is a requirement. It's a requirement by regulations and standards and guidances certainly endorsed by FDA, and that they will leverage in an inspection, ratcheting back to those parts of the GMP that Paula shared with us. They always find that hook that they can connect to. I think the other thing that's really important is that after the quality agreement is approved, you can't walk away. It's not okay, that's done. Everybody's just going to automatically do this. And I think that living that quality agreement and demonstrating adequate oversight is a bigger challenge than creating and approving the quality agreement. And I think one of the things I certainly appreciate about ICH E6 revision 2 is in several places where it talks about the use of a risk-based approach, it requires a rationale to be written and documented. And I think when you start a relationship with a third party and you have a brand new quality agreement and a brand new MSA, based on the results of your audit and your interactions and how difficult or easy it was to resolve the quality agreement, that all of that plus the regulatory compliance history of the third party and any other information that you can glean should inform your oversight strategy. How are you going to oversee? What metrics should be in place? Are there now things that you should consider adding to your quality agreement based on oversight and the things you learned through that process? Because as Paula said, your quality agreement has to be a living document. You need to live into it every day, but you must also be willing to make revisions to it as your relationship matures and as metrics would prompt you to move forward. Thank you very much.